Hey, so now that we've read the book and debriefed on the chapters, I want to prepare you to read the next section. So at this point, you're going to see a page break in the text. If you have a hard copy, it'll say part two. This really begins the trial scene when we're going to see a lot of racism. And I think it's crucial that we read some articles that I have linked. So one is an opinion piece from a journal that says no, To Kill a Mockingbird should not be taught in 2018. So I want to highlight a couple of things from this particular article. Yes, don't mind all of the ads. An 1897 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, American sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois coined the phrase double consciousness to describe the sublimated conflict with which the Black person in America must wrestle at all times. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. This author begins to say that To Kill a Mockingbird is unjustly penned or perceived by the author, particularly because our narrator is a white child. It says here that it is, we're given a narrative about an entire community based on the reality of a helplessly facile and ill-suited narrator. The story is told through the voice of a white child, Scout Finch, and it's centered on the toils of her white father, Atticus Finch, whose conflict rests on the judicial fate of a Black man named Tom Robinson. And from this angle, we are going to begin seeing the events unfold, but the problem is it has an immature voice, and through that immature voice, it pours out a mind of immaturely attuned thoughts that don't understand racialized people as human beings who continue to exist even when white people aren't thinking about them. So the cast will be white characters. You have Scout's family, her neighbors, the Yules, and they're actually living people with their own motivations and desires. The social realities of the 1930s South are the novel's subject, but Tom Robinson, on the other hand, the main person in the novel that is opposed and criticized and has to live with the bulk of this unjust decision and the injustice of the time is what they call a cipher. He's a formless void into which the white imagination projects itself. We know hardly anything of his family, their grief, their rage at the unjust society into which they're violently displaced at birth. We read nothing of the nights that his mother must have wrapped her hands around her empty room and cried out to God to save her child. What we do know is the pitiful fate that he faces at the hands of a justice system that's engineered to destroy him. So Tom Robinson and the Black community in this fictional town are the novel's object. It doesn't do much to really help with the empathy for this character. And so many people, and it makes the argument at the top, it shouldn't be read in schools because it doesn't do a good job of fully understanding what it was like to be in Tom Robinson's shoes. It shows what it was like from a white person's perspective, which isn't altogether unhelpful, but for the purpose of this opinion-based article, it says, for instance, in a particular school district, the school board had a memo, and this is what the memo said: the use of racist texts as entry points into discussions about racism is hardly for the benefit of Black students who already experience racism. This should give us pause. Who does the use of the text center upon? Who does it serve? Why do we continue to teach them? Why do we teach them? They believe that it fits within a framework that is a dangerous thing because we refer to a white writer who is teaching about things from a white perspective, but are we really being introduced to racism in its complete context? So that's why it's important to pair with other articles that can give us a little bit more insight. So we're going to go to a report. There was an instance in 1931 that had a similar accusation of rape from a Black person to a white girl. So there will be two girls that are kind of sketchy in character, so I'd like you to read over this article. It gives the history of the case and who these girls are. They decide to sneak away. They dress in overalls and they hobo their way by freight on a train to Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is 97 miles away. Hoboing was a natural practice in 1931. The other article here that kind of expounds upon this will give you a better picture of what that is. It says hoboing was a common pastime in the Depression year of 1931. For some, riding freights was an appealing adventure compared to the drudgery and dreariness of their daily lives. Others hopped rail cars to move from one fruitless job search to the next. 2 dozen or so, mainly male, mainly young, whites and blacks, would ride the Southern Railroad's Chattanooga to Memphis freight on March 25th, 1931. Among them were 4 teenagers hoping to investigate a rumor of government jobs in Memphis, hauling logs on the river. And then there were 5 black teens from various parts of Georgia, 4 young whites, 2 males, and 2 females who were dressed in overalls rode the train, returning to Huntsville from an unsuccessful job search in the cotton mills of Chattanooga, Tennessee. So it wasn't uncommon. It was fairly uncommon for these girls to dress like boys and to be hanging around some more rough crowds. So one of them was named Victoria Price, and she becomes the primary in the case. The other, we're not exactly sure. She doesn't come to the trials and speak out because Victoria Price was the older. Ruby Bates was only 17 years old at the time, so she would have been a minor. The story goes that on the return to Huntsville, the girls are hopping aboard the train, and there is a fight that breaks out. So you can kind of read through this. The white gang picks a fight with the group of black boys that are on the train. And what they do is they attack, and then they force the white boys off the train. They're forced to jump from the freight car with it still moving at a fast rate and speed. One of the white boys, Orville Gilly, who said he was afraid to jump for fear he would be killed, was allowed to remain. One testified that he pulled Gilly back on the car as he was hanging over the edge for fear that he might fall and be killed. So they run off to go tell what's happening. Well, meanwhile, Victoria Price and Ruby are still on the train with the African American boys. And as the train comes into the station, a lynch crowd has already gathered because the white boys went and kind of snitched. And so a group of a lynch mob appears to take them captive and they are accused in that moment of rape of the girls. And the story goes to trial over and over and over. If you read about it, you're going to see that the first trial was on April 6th of that year, not too long after it happened, but it persisted for about 15 years. The men were released, and then they were brought back, and then they were released and brought back. So it gives us a little bit more perspective. If you read the actual case notes, the trial notes, that's what this is, and it's a lot, but I'd like you to skim it, and there will be some discussion questions for you on Flipgrid to kind of process about this. But it's an interesting story that speaks to the reality, not just from the perspective of an ignorant, innocent white child. Here's another kind of summary of the trial with some pictures and more details about the case. So while our trial with Atticus is fictionalized, this is actual information that links to real-world events that took place and were widely talked about. And so it's not unlikely that it corresponds somewhat with the events in the book as well. So keep that in mind as you read through it, and you can find out what ended up happening, whether or not they were able to prove them innocent or guilty. So like I said, just scroll through the whole article and you'll get to see continuing what ended up happening with the trial. So let's move to the final link that I want you to explore. It's called Teaching to Kill a Mockingbird Today and Coming to Terms with Race, Racism, and America's Novel. It's an article that, again, I believe you'll probably end up skimming. I don't expect you to read it in its entirety, but I want to direct you to a couple of things. Atticus Finch is called the American hero for a lot of reasons that we've already discussed. But when you're processing through the book, it's really important to recognize that he's a hero in the context of the racism that was really prevalent at his time. But a lot of students today have difficulty thinking, well, I don't relate to this type of racism. We're going to talk about in this article two terms applied to racism. There's old racism and new racism. And I think that this table 1 and table 2 on pages 282 and 283 kind of help to describe what that looks like. So old racism, as we see very clearly articulated in the book, is a system of prejudice and supremacy that was very visible. We had segregation with the Jim Crow laws that we've talked about. It works through a type of imperialized knowledge, the individual racism, power applied to a physical body. That was the lynchings and like the physical harm that was done to the individual. If we compare that to a new form of racism, it's a system of power and domination as opposed to prejudice and supremacy. So we may not think, oh, I'm better than that person. It might not be a conscious thought, but you need to think about where are there systems that oppress certain populations, that where there's a sense of inequity in an institution. So you might take a school, for instance, and we know that with in schools and workplaces, there's something called affirmative action that makes sure that people of minority races, from minority backgrounds, have equal access to education because they didn't grow up with the same type of school system or with the same type of access to their parents pouring into them and college educated that were giving them the same opportunities. And so think about it less in terms of, well, who do I think is less than me? And more in terms of where is a system preventing access equitably or equally from one group to another. Another thing you want to think about with new racism versus old racism is that new racism is invisible. Where old racism, you know, they literally had the signs up there for the Jim Crow laws. New racism is an invisible, permeating, kind of a power dynamic and struggle that is embedded in who has access. So we can talk about that more in the discussion. It also works through privileged knowledge. Think about it. What knowledge do you have access to because you're privileged? First of all, you have an education. That implies privilege. What other knowledge do you have access to because of your privilege? How many of you have college educated parents? How many of you speak the dominant language that is spoken in the United States? All of those are privileged points of knowledge, privileged aspects that work toward you being favored in a system of power. This power is built into institutions. Who gets into good colleges? It's people who have been raised and basically packaged by their upbringing and their environment and their society to be fluent in the language, that have all of the essential bits of knowledge, that have gotten to have access to opportunities in your extracurricular activities. So if you've been able to do sports, if your family has had enough money to do that, and you've been able to do things like drama or dance, all of these things provide you opportunities and privilege that give you an advantage when working with people, when communicating, when thinking critically, that give you a power advantage. So that's important to look at. And then in the second example, it shows you more about the old racism. And then here's the table of the new racism and how it works. And it kind of explains what I was just talking about, but in the context of To Kill a Mockingbird itself. So go ahead and look at that. And then in light of all of these things that I've just talked about, I'd like you to have a discussion about this on Flipgrid, and you'll find the assignment posted in your weekly email. So please read those articles, because I will know if you don't.